Livy on Hannibal, Book 30. 1. It was now the 16th year of the Punic War, and the consuls Gnaeus Servilius and Gaius Servilius raised in the Senate the question of the state of the Republic, the conduct of the war, and the assignment of provinces. The senators decided that the consuls should agree between them, or use sortition to decide which of them would have as his responsibility Bruttium and the operations against Hannibal, and which Etruria and Ligurians. The one to whom Bruttium fell was to assume leadership of Publius Sempronius's army, and Publius Sempronius, who also received a year's extension of his imperium as proconsul, as to succeed Publius Licinius, who was to return to Rome. Licinius now enjoyed a good military reputation, in addition to all his other qualities, in which he was unrivaled by any of his fellow citizens, for all the advantages a man could have had been lavished on him by nature and fortune. He was of noble birth and wealthy. He was remarkable for his good looks and his physical strength. He was regarded as a superb orator, whether he had to plead a case in court, or whether he had occasion to speak for or against a motion in the Senate, or before the people. He was an expert in pontifical law, and on top of this, his consulship had now also given him a reputation as a soldier. The same decision was taken for Etruria and the Ligurians as had been taken for Bruttium. Marcus Cornelius was instructed to pass command of his army to the new consul, while he himself, with an extension of his imperium, was to have Gaul as his area of responsibility, taking over the legions that Lucius Scribonius had commanded the previous year. The consuls proceeded to a sortition for their duties, and Bruttium fell to Capio, and Etruria to Geminus. The sortition for the praetorian responsibilities followed. Aelius Paetus drew the urban jurisdiction, Publius Lentulus Sardinia, Publius Villius Sicily, and Quintilius Varus Ariminum, and 2 legions under his command that had previously served under Spurius Lucretius. Lucretius, too, had the imperium extended. He was to rebuild entirely the town of Genua, which had been destroyed by the Carthaginian Mago. The extension to Publius Scipio's imperium was not defined in terms of time, but by the completion of his assignment. It would last until the war in Africa was ended. A decree was also passed for the holding of public prayers to ask that Scipio's enterprise in crossing to Africa prove advantageous to the Roman people, to the commander himself, and to his army. 2. A force of 3,000 was raised for service in Sicily, because all the crack troops in the province had been shipped off to Africa. It was further decided that the defense of the coastline of Sicily should be secured with 40 ships, in case an enemy fleet should cross from Africa. Villius, therefore, took 13 new vessels with him to Sicily. The others would be old ones, overhauled on the island. This fleet was put under the admiralship of Marcus Pomponius, praetor, the previous year, whose imperium was accordingly extended, and he had fresh troops brought from Italy and assigned to the ships. The senators decided on a fleet of the same number of vessels for Gnaeus Octavius, who had also been praetor the previous year, for the defense of the Sardinian coast, and he was given the same extension of his imperium. The praetor, Lentulus, was instructed to provide 2,000 fighting men for these ships. Then there was the coast of Italy, where the Carthaginians would send a fleet was unclear, though it seemed likely that they would head for some unguarded spot, and so Marcus Marcius, a praetor the previous year, was given the responsibility of patrolling the coast again with 40 ships. The consuls enrolled 3,000 fighting men for that fleet, in accordance with a senatorial decree, and they also enrolled 2 city legions to meet all the contingencies that can arise in war. Spain was officially assigned to its old commanders Lucius Lentulus and Lucius Manlius Ascendinus, who again, Spain was officially assigned to its old commanders Lucius Lentulus and Lucius Manlius Ascendinus, who kept their armies and their imperium. I'm guessing that name is actually Ascendinus. Ascendinus. Lucius Manlius Ascendinus. I don't know. The pronunciation, you work it out. It's Acidinus. Ascendinus. Roman operations that year were conducted with a total of 20 legions and 160 warships. The praetors were then ordered to leave Rome to assume their responsibilities, but the consuls were charged with staging the great games of Titus Manlius Torquatus before leaving. When he was dictator, Torquatus had made a vow that these games would be celebrated 4 years later if the Republic remained in the same condition as it was then. Reports of prodigies from several places aroused fresh superstition in the hearts of people. On the Capitol, it was believed crows had not only torn away some gold with their beaks, but had actually ingested it. At Antium, some mice gnawed at a golden crown. A huge swarm of locusts covered the whole countryside around Capua, but how they got there was not known. At Rieti, a foal was born with 5 feet. At Anania, there were shooting stars at various points in the sky, followed by a huge blazing meteor at Frusino. A bow encircled the sun in a thin line, and then that circle itself was enclosed by a larger solar halo. Ooh. At Tarpinum, the soil in the countryside subsided, producing a huge hollow in the ground. When one of the consuls sacrificed his first animal, the liver's head was missing. These prodigies were expiated with the sacrifice of full-grown animals, and the gods to whom sacrifices were to be made were announced by the Pontifical College. Three. That would be pontifical. Sorry. 3. This business taken in hand, the consuls and praetors left to assume their responsibilities. All of them, however, had their attention focused on Africa, as though that were their allotted duty. Either they perceived that this was now the focal point of the whole war, or they wished to be obliging to Scipio, to whom the eyes of the entire state were now turned. As a result, clothing and grain were being shipped to him not just from Sardinia, as noted above, but from Sicily and Spain as well. and from Sicily he was also shipped weapons and all manner of supplies, and at no point during the winter had there been any let up in the numerous military activities which Scipio had around him on every side. He was blockading Utica. The camp of Hasdrubal lay before his eyes. The Carthaginians had launched their ships, and they had their fleet at the ready and equipped to intercept his supplies. Meanwhile, Scipio had not lost sight of his plan of making up with Sphax, and he wondered whether, with regard to his wife, there had been a cooling of his passion from too much enjoyment of her. But from Sphax came suggestions for peace terms with the Carthaginians, based on the Romans quitting Africa and the Carthaginians Italy, rather than any prospect that he would switch loyalties if the war went on. For myself, I am inclined to the opinion, and such is the version of most of the sources, that these negotiations took place through envoys rather than that, as Valerius Antius records. Sphax came in person to parley in the Roman camp. At first, the Roman commander paid hardly any attention to the terms he suggested. Later, however, he became less intransigent in rejecting the very same conditions, and held out the hope that an agreement on the matter might be reached by the frequent interchange of ideas. This would give his men an acceptable pretext for coming and going to the enemy camp. The Carthaginian winter quarters had been built from materials indiscriminately brought together from the countryside, and so the structures were almost entirely of wood. The Numidians, in particular, were quartered in huts of interwoven reeds, most of them under roofs of thatch, and they were dispersed here and there in no particular order, with some of them even encamped beyond the ditch, and the palisade, as happens when ground is occupied without regulations. When word of this was brought to Scipio, it had given him hope of gaining an opportunity to burn down the enemy camps. 4. Along with the envoys he sent to Sphax, Scipio would also send as their attendants some senior centurions of proven courage and good judgment, dressed as slaves. These men could therefore wander here and there about the camp while the envoys were parleying. They could thus gather intelligence on all entrances and exits, on the layout and plan of the camp as a whole, and its various sections on where Carthaginians and Numidians were billeted, and on the distance between Hasdrubal's encampment and that of the king. At the same time, they could find out how the outposts and sentries functioned, and whether night or day would be more favorable for a surprise attack. And as there were regular discussions, different parties of men would be sent along to increase the number who could be familiarized with the whole scene. The increasing frequency of the talks was every day raising more sanguine hopes of peace in Sphax, and through him in the Carthaginians. But the Romans then told him that they were forbidden to return to their commander unless they were given a clear response. So they declared if Sphax's mind was made up, he should express his opinion, or if he had to discuss the matter with Hasdrubal and the Carthaginians, then he should do so. It was time now for peace to be established, or else for an all-out war effort to be undertaken, they said. While Hasdrubal's opinion was being sought by Sphax, and the Carthaginians by Hasdrubal, the spies had the time to get a good look at everything, and Scipio had the time to make all the necessary preparations. Furthermore, a natural consequence of this talk of peace, and the prospect of concluding it, was to make the Carthaginians and the Numidians less concerned with taking precautions against their becoming. In the meantime, the object of any hostile act Finally, an answer was brought back, continuing a number of unreasonable conditions that had been deliberately added, because of the Romans' apparent eagerness for peace, and these very conveniently save Scipio the excuse he wanted for ending the truce. He told the king's messenger that he would take the proposals to his advisory council, and the next day he gave as his answer that he alone had unsuccessfully advocated the peace plan. Nobody else was in favor of it, so he said Sphax should be informed that his only prospect of peace with the Romans lay in abandoning the Carthaginians. In this way Scipio ended the truce so that he would have the latitude to carry out his designs honorably. He launched his ships, it was already the start of spring, and placed on board war machines and catapults, given the impression that he was going to attack Utica from the sea. He also sent off 2,000 infantry to seize the hill, which he had earlier held, overlooking Utica. His plan was to distract the enemy's attention from the undertaking by giving them something else to worry about, and also to prevent any sortie from the city or an attack on his camp, which, when he himself left to take on Sphax and Hasdrubal, would be left only lightly garrisoned. 5. After these preliminaries, Scipio summoned his advisory council, and instructed his spies and After these preliminaries, Scipio summoned his advisory council, and instructed his spies and Massinissa, who had detailed knowledge of the enemy, to produce the intelligence they had gathered. Finally, he set before them his plan of action for the oncoming night, and ordered the tribunes to lead the legions from the camp the moment that the council was adjourned and the trumpets had given the signal. Following Scipio's orders, the troops began to move out towards sunset, and at about the first watch they formed up their column for the march. It was a 7-mile journey, and moving at an easy pace, they reached the enemy camp around midnight. There Scipio put some of his troops, along with Massinissa and his Numidians, under the command of Laelius, ordering him to attack the camp of Sphax and hurl firebrands into it. He then took Laelius and Massinissa aside and appealed to each of them to be all the more diligent and careful, since the dark lessened the possibility of planned action. He himself would launch an attack on Hasdrubal and the Punic camp, he said, but would not begin until he saw the fire in the camp of the king, and that was not slow in appearing. For when the first huts were torched, the fire took hold and immediately engulfed everything around them, and then spread throughout the camp in an unbroken blaze, and such a widespread conflagration during the night inevitably caused great consternation. The Africans, however, thought the fire was an accident unrelated to the enemy and the war, and came streaming forth without weapons to douse the flames. They ran into the armed enemy, and in particular the Numidians, whom Massinissa, thoroughly familiar with the camp of the king, had posted in opportune spots at the exits. Many of the enemy were consumed by the flames as they lay half asleep in their beds. Many rushed off in headlong flight and were trampled underfoot as they clambered over each other in the restricted gateways. 6. The shimmering flames were sighted first by the Carthaginian sentries, and then by others who had been awakened by the nocturnal commotion, and these too were similarly deluded into believing that the fire was accidental. In addition, the noise of men being killed or wounded made them unable to grasp what was really happening, and they were unsure whether the cries came simply from the turmoil in the dark, and so, unarmed and each on his own initiative, Inasmuch as they had no suspicion that they were under attack, they came rushing from all the gates, each taking what for him was the closest path, and carrying only what would serve to douse the fire, and ran right into the Roman column. They were all killed, and that was not simply a matter of an enemy's hatred, it was also to prevent anyone escaping with news of what was happening. Scipio then lost no time in charging the gates, which, as one might expect in such confusion, had been left unguarded. Torches were hurled on the closest buildings, and flames leaped up. At first they seemed to flicker in several different places, but then, spreading stealthily and continuously, they suddenly consumed everything in a single blaze. Severely burned men and animals choked the roads leading to the gates, first in their unruly flight, and then with their dead bodies. Those not killed by the fire fell by the sword, and the two camps were destroyed in a single disaster. The two commanders, however, made good their escape. From the many thousands of soldiers, a mere 2,000 infantry and 500 cavalry got away, and these were poorly armed, and most of them wounded and badly burned. About 40,000 men were slaughtered or consumed by the flames, and more than 5,000 taken prisoner, many of them Carthaginian noblemen, and 11 of them senators. 174 military standards were captured, and more than 2,700 Numidian horses. 6 elephants were taken, and 8 died by the sword or in the fire. Huge quantities of arms were captured. The commander dedicated them to Vulcan and burned them all. 7. After escaping the battle, Hasdrubal, accompanied by a handful of the Africans, had headed for the closest city, and all who had survived the fight had, following in the steps of their leader, also converged on this town. Then, fearing that it might surrender to Scipio, Hasdrubal left. In a short while, the gates opened, and the Romans were also admitted, and in view of the voluntary surrender, there were no reprisals. Shortly afterwards, 2 cities were captured and pillaged, and the booty from them was awarded to the men, along with all that had been rescued from the flames when the camps were burned. Sphax entrenched himself in a fortified spot some 8 miles away, and Hasdrubal hastened to Carthage to prevent the shock of the recent defeat causing any weakening of strategy. In Carthage there was at first such a state of alarm that people believed Scipio would abandon Utica and immediately lay siege to their city. The Cephets, amongst the Carthaginians, they held the equivalent of consular power, accordingly convened the Senate, and there it came down to a struggle between 3 points of view. One proposal was for sending a deputation to Scipio to discuss peace. A second was for recalling Hannibal to protect his country from a war that would be their undoing. The third showed a truly Roman resolve in time of crisis. It advocated rebuilding the army and encouraging Sphax not to abandon the war. Because Hasdrubal, who was attending the meeting, and all members of the Barca faction favored war, this was the proposal that prevailed. After that, a troop levy got under way in the city and the countryside, and envoys were dispatched to Sphax, who was also vigorously preparing for a renewal of hostilities. It was Sphax's wife who had prevailed on him to do this, and no longer with sweet nothings as before, though these were themselves powerful enough to sway the lover's heart, but with entreaties and appeals to his compassion, her eyes swimming with tears, she would implore him not to let down her father and her country, and not to allow Carthage to go up in the same flames as had destroyed his camp. The envoys also brought with them some well-timed assurance. 4,000 Celtiberians, men in their prime, who had been hired in Spain by their own recruiting officers, and met them in the environs of a city called Opa. They said that, in addition, Hasdrubal would very soon be there with a force that was not to be despised. As a result, Sfax did more than simply give the envoys a warm response. He actually brought to their attention a large number of Numidian peasants to whom he had in recent days given weapons and horses, and declared that he would call up all the young men in his kingdom. He was aware, he said, that the disaster they had suffered was the result of a fire, not a battle, and that the loser in war was the man defeated in the field. Such was Sfax's reply to the envoys, and only days later Hasdrubal and he once again joined forces. That army totaled about 30,000 men. 8. Assuming that, as far as Sfax and the Carthaginians were concerned, the conflict was at an end, Scipio was now pressing on with the siege of Utica. He was actually moving the siege engines up to the walls when the news of their renewed hostilities drew him away from the operation. He left a small force merely to keep up the facade of a blockade being maintained by land and sea, and he himself proceeded against the enemy with the main body of his troops. At first he dug in on a hill about 4 miles from the king's camp, and the next day he went down with his cavalry into what are called the Great Plains, which lie at the foot of the hill. There he spent the day approaching and harassing the enemy's outposts with light skirmishing. Similarly, on the 2 days that followed, both sides in turn engaged in disorderly sallies here and there, without achieving any worthwhile result. But on the 4th day they both came out to do battle. The Roman commander deployed his principes behind the Hastati, whose maniples formed the front line, leaving the Triarii in reverse, and he placed the Italian cavalry on the right wing, and the Numidians and Massinissa on the left. Sfax and Hasdrubal positioned the Numidians facing the Italian horse, and the Carthaginians facing Massinissa, and they placed the Celtiberians in the middle of the line to face the maniples of the legions. Such was the formations in which the two armies encountered each other. With the first charge, the enemy wings, the Carthaginians as well as the Numidians, were both driven back at the same time. The Numidians, who were mostly peasants, were no match for the Roman cavalry, and the Carthaginians, new recruits themselves, were no match for Massinissa, a redoubtable figure, and especially so after his recent victory. Though shorn of both wings, the Celtiberian line still stood its ground. Ignorant of the land, they could see no prospect of safety in flight, and there was no hope of clemency from Scipio. They and their people had been well treated by him, and had still come to Africa as hired soldiers to fight him. And so, with the enemy completely surrounding them, they fought stubbornly to the end, falling over each other in heaps, while attention was entirely focused on the Celtiberians. Sfax and Hasdrubal gained some time to make good their escape, and night fell on the victors, exhausted from the bloodbath which had gone on beyond the battle. 9. The next day Scipio sent Laelius and Massinissa together with all the Roman and Numidian cavalry, and the lightest armed of the infantry in pursuit of Sfax and Hasdrubal. Scipio himself took the main body of the army, and proceeded to reduce the neighboring cities, all of them under Carthaginian control. In some cases he did this by giving them hope, in others by intimidation or the use of force. At Carthage there was sheer terror. People assumed that Scipio, moving around the country with his forces, would quickly subdue all their neighbors and make a sudden attack on Carthage itself. The walls were therefore being repaired and strengthened with buttresses, and everyone was bringing in from the country whatever he needed for facing a protracted siege. Peace was rarely mentioned. More often there was talk of sending envoys to summon Hannibal home, but most felt that the fleet had been mobilized to intercept Roman supplies should be sent to Utica in order to catch the enemy ships anchored there off their guard with a surprise attack. It might even overwhelm the naval camp, which was left only lightly garrisoned. This was the strategy they favored most, but they nonetheless voted to send a deputation to Hannibal. They thought that even a completely successful operation by the fleet would lead only to limited relief of the siege of Utica, and for the protection of Carthage itself they were left with no commander but Hannibal, and no army apart from his. The ships were therefore launched the next day, and at the same time the envoys also left for Italy, and under the stimulus of their plight, all was being done in a hurry, with every one thinking that any slacking on his part was a betrayal of the safety of them all. Scipio was in the process of training around an army that was now heavily burdened with spoils from many cities. He sent his prisoners of war and other booty to the old camp near Utica, and focusing now on Carthage, he seized Tynes, some 15 miles from Carthage, its garrison having fled and abandoned it. Tynes was a place enjoying protection from its geographical situation as well as defense works. It was also visible from Carthage, and itself afforded a view both of the city and the sea around it. From Tynes, just when the Romans were constructing their rampart, the enemy fleet was spotted heading from Carthage to Utica. The work was therefore abandoned, and the order given to march. The troops began to move out at a rapid pace, so that their ships would not be taken by surprise, for these were facing the shore to take part in the siege, and were in no way ready for a naval battle. The vessels had artillery and siege engines on board, and had either been converted for use as transports, or had been brought up so close to the walls that they could be used for scaling in place of the usual mound and bridges. There was no way they could have stood up to a fleet and could maneuver swiftly, and was fully equipped with nautical gear and weaponry. On reaching this destination, Scipio abandoned the strategy usually employed in a naval engagement. He set the warships which could have given protection to the other vessels in the rearmost position, close to shore, and he had 4 rows of freighters deployed to form a wall against the enemy. Fearing that his lines could be broken in the tumult of battle, he harnessed the freighters with a relay of mast and yardarms, running from one ship to another, and with strong ropes that lashed them together in what was virtually an unbroken chain. He also set planks on them to form a path along the whole line of ships, and under the bridges so formed he left spaces to enable scouting boats to run out against the enemy, and then beat a retreat in safety. All of this was put in place as swiftly as circumstances allowed. and then about 1,000 hand-picked men were sent aboard the freighters to defend them. A huge stock of weapons, mostly of the throwing variety, was also brought together in the numbers sufficient for an engagement of any length. Thus prepared, the Romans remained on the alert, waiting their enemy's approach. Had the Carthaginians moved quickly, they could have taken their enemy by surprise with their first onset, for confusion reigned everywhere and men were scurrying about in disorder. But they were shaken by their defeats on land, and after them they had little confidence even on the sea. There they were stronger than their enemy. They spent the day sailing around in a dilatory manner, and towards sunset they put in at a harbor that the Africans called Sokmon. At sunrise the next day they deployed their vessel out at sea, anticipating a regular naval engagement, and expecting the Romans to come out to face them. They held their position for some time, finally attacking the freighters only when they could see that there was no movement on the enemy's part. What developed was very dissimilar to a naval engagement, and more than anything looked like ships making an attack on walls. The freighters had the clear advantage in height. The Carthaginians were hurling their missiles from their warships at a point above them unsuccessfully, for the most part because of the upward trajectory, and those thrown from the heights of the freighters fell more heavily, and, thanks to the weight, were more accurate. The scouting boats and other light craft that would sally forth through the spaces under the planked gangways were at first merely sunk by the enemy warships with their greater momentum and size. Later on, they also proved to be an obstruction to their own defensive troops, for becoming interspersed amongst the enemy ships, they often obliged these men to hold back their weapons for fear of hitting their own side with a poorly aimed shot. Finally, the Carthaginians proceeded to hurl poles tipped with an iron hook, harpagons in military terminology, from their vessels onto those of the Romans. That could be pronounced as harpagones or harpagons. The Romans found it impossible to hack through these instruments, or the chains of which they were slung. The result was that, as each Carthaginian warship backed water, dragging a freighter that was hooked, one could see the cables by which it was connected to the other vessels, snapping, or a number of ships being dragged off in a row. By this particular process, all the bridges were torn apart, barely giving the fighting men on them time to jump over to the second row of ships, and about 60 freighters were hauled off to Carthage by the stern. The euphoria this inspired in the Carthaginians was not justified by the action, but it was all the more gratifying since it appeared as a single unexpected gleam of joy, no matter how small, interrupting an unbroken sequence of disasters and misery. In addition, the Roman fleet had apparently come close to being destroyed, and this had been thwarted only by the hesitation on the part of the captains of their own ships and the timely arrival of Scipio. 11. It so happened that at about this time Laelius and Massinissa had arrived in Numidia after a march of about 14 days, and there the Masuli happily bestowed on Massinissa his father's throne, as being their long-lost king. Sphax, whose officers and garrisons were driven from the kingdom, now kept to his old realm, though he had not the slightest intention of remaining inactive. Lovesick, he was under constant pressure from his wife and father-in-law, and he possessed men and horses in such numbers that the very sight of the military resources of a kingdom that had prospered for many years could have inspired a spirit even less barbarous and unruly than his. He therefore gathered together all his men who were fit for war, and distributed horses, armor, and weapons amongst them, and he also formed up his cavalry in squadrons and his infantry in cohorts, as he had learned to do earlier from the Roman centurions. He then went out to meet the enemy with an army no smaller than his former force, but one that was almost completely new and without training. He encamped close to them, and at first a few horsemen went forward from the outpost, reconnoitering at a safe remote, but then running back to their comrades when driven off by a shower of spears. After that, there were minor sorties from both sides in turn, with more coming into the fray as men were driven back and roused to indignation. This is what usually prompts cavalry engagements, with the successful side's hopes and the defeated side's anger, bringing comrades into the action. So it was in this instance. The battle was started by a few, but then the wish to join the action eventually brought the entire cavalry of both sides pouring onto the field. While it was a cavalry engagement, pure and simple, there was little possibility of resisting the Massae-Sulians' superior numbers, as Sphax sent his huge columns of men into action. Then the Roman infantry made a sudden charge through the gaps that the cavalry squadrons left for them, and thereby brought stability to the battle line, stemming the wild onset of the enemy. At this, the barbarians first of all slowed their horses. Then they came to a halt, and were almost thrown into disorder by this strange way of fighting. Eventually, they not only gave ground before the enemy infantry, but they also failed to withstand the cavalry, which was given fresh courage now by the assistance of the infantry. By this time, too, the legionary troops were coming up, and at that point it was not simply a matter of the Massae-Sulians not waiting for the initial onset. They could not even resist the sight of the Roman standards and weapons. So powerful was their memory of earlier defeats, or else their present fear. "12. Sphax then rode up to the enemy cavalry squadrons, hoping he could check the flight of his men by putting them to shame when he put himself in harm's way. But his horse received a serious wound, and he was thrown off. He was overpowered, taken prisoner, and brought alive to Laelius, a sight that would please Massinissa more than anyone. A loss of life in that battle was lighter than the margin of victory might have suggested, because the fighting had been limited to cavalry. No more than 5,000 were killed, and less than half that figure were taken prisoner when an attack was launched on the camp, to which large numbers, dismayed at losing their king, had made their way. The capital of Sphax's realm was Cirta, and it was here that a huge body of men had come after the route. Massinissa declared that nothing could be more gratifying at that moment than to tour his ancestral kingdom as victor, now recovered after such a long period of time, but he cautioned that it was just as important not to fritter away time when things went well as when they went badly. If Laelius would allow him to go ahead to Cirta with the cavalry and with Sphax in irons, he said, he would bring about confusion and panic everywhere. Laelius could then follow with the infantry in easy stages. Laelius agreed, and Massinissa went ahead to Cirta, where he had the leading citizens of the town summoned to parley. While these men were still unaware of what had befallen the king, Massinissa made no progress with them either by informing them of what had happened or by threats or persuasion. Then the king was brought to irons into their sight. The shameful spectacle provoked an outburst of lamentation. Some abandoned the walls in panic, and others hurriedly greeting they should try to win the victor's favor. Some abandoned the walls in panic, and others, hurriedly agreeing they should try to win the victor's favor, flung open the gates. As for Massinissa, he first dispatched troops to make the rounds of the gates and suitable spots on the walls to prevent any escape, and then galloped in to seize the palace. As he entered the vestibule, Sophoniba, wife of Sphax and daughter of Hasdrubal, met him right on the threshold. When she saw him surrounded by a body of soldiers, cutting a conspicuous figure with his armor and general appearance, she assumed, as was indeed the case, that he was the king. She flung herself before his knees and said, "The gods and your own valor and good fortune have seen to it that you have absolute power over us. But perhaps a captive may be allowed to make a suppliant plea before the man who can decide if she lives or dies, and to touch his knees and his conquering hand. If so, then I beg and entreat you, by the royal majesty in which we two lived until a short time ago, and in the name of the Numidian race, which provided a common bond between you and Sphax, and I beg you by the gods who preside over this palace, with a prayer that they welcome you with more favorable omens than those with which they sent Sphax from here, to grant a suppliant this favor, that you personally decide the fate of your captive, no matter what your feelings are in that regard, and not let me face the overbearing and ruthless judgment of some Roman. Had I been no more than Sphax's wife, I would still have preferred to rely on the honor of a Numidian, of a man born, as I was, in Africa, rather than that of a foreigner from overseas. But you can understand what a Carthaginian and what a daughter of Hasdrubal has to fear from a Roman. I earnestly entreat you, if you can achieve it in no other way, to save me from falling under the control of the Romans by letting me die now." Sophoniba was the woman of outstanding beauty, and in her prime she was now grasping Massinissa's right hand and begging him for an undertaking that she not be surrendered to any Roman, her language more than of love than of entreaty. The result was that the victor's heart succumbed to pity, but more than that, thanks to the Numidian proclivity for sensuality, the victor was brought to his knees by passion for his own captive. He gave her his right hand as a guarantee that he would fulfill her request, and went into the palace. Massinissa then began to puzzle over how he could honor the commitment he had made. Finding no solution, he was prompted by his infatuation to employ an ill-considered and shameless plan of action, and gave orders for a marriage ceremony to be hurriedly arranged for that very day. His intention was not to allow either Laelius or even Scipio himself any leeway in deciding the case of a presumed captive, for he would by then be married to Massinissa. Laelius appeared on the scene when the ceremony was over. Far from hiding his disapproval of what had taken place, his initial reaction was to try to tear her from the wedding couch and sent her off to Scipio, along with Sphax and the other prisoners. He was then overcome by the pleas of Massinissa, who begged him to leave it to Scipio to decide to which of the two kings' fortunes Sophonuba would be appended. Laelius accordingly sent off Sphax and the prisoners of war, and with Massinissa's assistance reduced the other cities of Numidia, held by the king's garrisons. 13. Following the announcement that Sphax was being brought into the camp, all the soldiers poured out in a crowd, as if to view a triumph. Sphax was at the front in chains, and a crowd of Numidian noblemen came after him. At that point, all the soldiers did as much as they could to play up Sphax's importance and the fame of his race, thereby aggrandizing their own victory. This was the king, they would say, whose grandeur was recognized by the two most powerful nations on earth, the Roman and the Carthaginian. So much so, indeed, that their own commander Scipio had left his assignment in Spain and his army to sail to Africa with a couple of triremes to seek the man's friendship. And the Carthaginian commander Hamilcar had not merely visited Sphax in his kingdom, he had even given him his daughter in marriage. Sphax, they said, had at the same time had both generals, the Carthaginian and the Roman, under his thumb, and just as both sides had used sacrifices to seek the blessing of the immortal gods, so too Sphax's friendship had been sought by both. Such had been his power, in fact, that he had driven Massinissa from the throne and brought him so low that his life was protected only by a report of his death, and by his evading detection, living in the woods like an animal on what he could catch. Such was the praise Sphax received from the bystanders. He was then brought to Scipio in his headquarters. Scipio, too, was touched when he compared the man's earlier and present fortunes, and also when he remembered their ties of hospitality, the clasping of their hands, and the pact they had made on the official and private level. These same reflections also came to Sphax, raising his confidence as he addressed his conqueror. For when Scipio asked him what he thought, For when Scipio asked him what he thought he would gain in not only rejecting a Roman alliance, but in actually opening hostilities, Sphax admitted that he had been wrong and had acted irrationally. But this did not date only from the time when he finally took up arms against the Roman people. That, he explained, had been the culmination, not the beginning of his madness. He had lost his mind and cast from his thoughts all private and official compacts at the time when he welcomed a Carthaginian woman into his home as his wife. Those wedding torches had sent his palace up in flames, he said, and that fury, that fiend, had resorted to all manner of wheedling in turn to turn his head and make him crazy. She had not rested until she had, with her own hands, fastened on him his abominable armor, making him face a man who was his host and friend. Even so, he added, while he might be done for and ruined, he still had one thing to console him in his misery. He could see that fiend and fury had now passed into the house and come of the greatest enemy he had in the world, and Massinissa had shown no more caution or resolve than Sphax. Because of his youth, he was even more thoughtless. His marriage to Sophonuba, at all events, was characterized by greater folly and abandon than his own had been. "14. These words came not only from hatred felt for an enemy. They were prompted, too, by the pangs of love felt by a man aware that his loved one was with a rival, and they brought Scipio no small measure of concern. The haste with which the marriage had been celebrated, virtually in the midst of battle, lent substance to the charges. Massinissa had not even consulted or waited for Laelius. He had been in such a feverish rush that he took the woman into his home as his wife, completing the wedding rites before his enemy's household deities, on the very same day as he had set eyes on her as a prisoner of war. And Scipio found this all the more offensive because when he himself had been a young man in Spain, he had been tempted by the looks of no female captive. He was mulling over such thoughts when Laelius and Massinissa appeared. Scipio welcomed both of them with a friendly expression, and lavished on them words of highest praise in the presence of a large number of his staff. He then took Massinissa aside and addressed him as follows. Massinissa, I think it was because you saw some merit in me that you came to me initially in Spain to establish ties of friendship with me, and then later in Africa, when you put yourself and all your hopes in my hands. But of those virtues for which you thought me worth seeking out, I would pride myself on none as much as my restraint and self-control. I wish, Massinissa, that you too could have added this quality to your other exceptional virtues. At our age, believe me, there is not so much danger from an enemy under arms as there is from the pleasures that surround us everywhere. A man who by his own self-control has held these in check and suppressed them has won much greater glory and a greater victory than we have now in defeating Sphax. Your dynamic and courageous conduct in my absence I have been delighted to record publicly, and to remember your other behavior I prefer to let you reflect on yourself rather than have you blush at my mention of it. Sphax was defeated and taken prisoner, under the auspices of the Roman people. That means that Sphax himself, his wife, his kingdom, his towns, with the men inhabiting them, in short, all that belonged to Sphax now belong to the Roman people as their spoils. The king and queen would have to be sent to Rome, even if the queen were not a Carthaginian citizen, and even if we did not discern in her father an enemy commander. It should be for the Senate and people of Rome to judge and decide the case of a woman who purportedly turned an allied monarch against us and drove him headlong into war. Have some self-control. See that you do not mar your many good qualities with a single vice and ruin the gratitude you have earned for all your services by an error of greater importance than what was responsible for the error. 15. When he heard this, not only did a blush of embarrassment spread over Massinissa's face, but tears also welled up in his eyes. He would, he said, abide by his commander's decision, but he begged him, as far as circumstances permitted, to take account of the promise he had thoughtlessly made. He had given and undertaken not to let Sophonica pass into anyone's hands. Then, in an agitated state, he left the headquarters for his own tent. There, after sending off any who might see him, he spent a long time sighing and moaning, which was easily audible to the men standing around the tent. Finally, he let out a groan, loud, and sent for a trusted slave, the man in whose keeping lay the poison that was to be used to meet the uncertainties of fortune, a regular practice with royalty. He ordered the man to mix the poison in a cup and take it to Sophonica, and at the same time to announce to her that Massinissa would have been glad to carry out his first commitment to her, one which he, as a husband, owed to his wife. Now those with the power were taking that option from him, and so he was honoring his second commitment, namely, to see that she did not fall into the hands of the Romans alive. She should think of her father, the commander of her country, and of the two kings to whom she had been married, and make her decision with them in mind. The servant came to Sophonica, bearing this message, and the poison along with it. "I accept this wedding gift," said Sophonica. "It is not unwelcome, if my husband has found it impossible to give his wife a greater one. But tell him this, my death would have been more acceptable had my marriage not coincided with my funeral." The resolve with which she spoke was no greater than that with which she took, and with no sign of perturbation, fearlessly drained the cup. When the incident was reported to him, Scipio feared that the headstrong young man might be prompted to some reckless act by his chagrin. He immediately summoned Massinissa, and by turns consoled him and gently rebuked him for having committed one hasty act to pay for another, and making the whole affair more grievous than it needed to be. The next day, in order to divert the man's thoughts from the pain he was suffering, Scipio mounted the tribunal and had an assembly called. There he first of all addressed Massinissa as king, and lavished extraordinary praise on him, and then conferred upon him a crown of gold, a golden bowl, a curule chair, and an ivory scepter, along with an embroidered toga and a tunic with a palm motif. He did him further honor by explaining that amongst the Romans there was nothing more splendid than a triumph, and those celebrating a triumph had no more splendid finery than that which the people of Rome thought Massinissa, alone of foreigners, now merited. He then paid tribute to Laelius, whom he also presented with a golden crown, and other soldiers were given awards in proportion to their merits. The king's feelings were soothed by such honors, and his hopes were raised that, with Sfax out of the way, he would soon take possession of all Numidia. XVI. The next day, in order to divert the man's thoughts from the pain he was suffering, Scipio mounted the tribunal and had an assembly called. There he first of all addressed Massinissa as king, and lavished extraordinary praise on him, and then conferred upon a crown of gold, a golden bowl, a curule chair, and an ivory scepter, along with the embroidered toga and tunic, with a palm motif. He did him further honor by explaining that amongst the Romans there was nothing more splendid than a triumph, and those celebrating the triumph had no more splendid finery than that which the people of Rome thought Massinissa, alone of foreigners, now merited. He then paid tribute to Laelius, whom he also presented with a golden crown. I'm sorry. We're gonna fast forward there. That's the end of 15 that I'm rereading. No, sorry. 16. Scipio sent Gaius Laelius to Rome with Sfax and the other prisoners of war, and envoys from Massinissa accompanied them. He then moved his camp back to Tynes, where he completed the fortifications he had started earlier. Thanks to the momentary success of their attack on the fleet, the Carthaginians were filled with an exhilaration that was not only of brief duration, but practically groundless. But they were stunned by the report of the capture of Sfax, in whom they had placed more hope than they had in Hasdrubal and his army. They no longer paid attention to anyone advocating military action, and they sent their 30 leading elders to sue for peace. This was a council that enjoyed considerable respect amongst the Carthaginians, and had a very great influence on the decision-making of the Senate. On their arrival in the headquarters in the Roman camp, the elders prostrated themselves before Scipio like men performing obeisance, a practice that I suppose derived from the area of their origin. Their language suited such obsequious flattery. Instead of trying to excuse their own culpability, and shifted initial responsibility for the war to Hannibal and those who supported his power. They asked for pardon for a city-state that had now been twice brought low by the recklessness of its citizens, and whose future preservation would once more depend on the favor of its enemies. It was powder the Roman people looked it was power the Roman people looked for from victory over its foes, not their destruction, they said, and Scipio could give them any orders he liked, as they were ready to follow them to the letter. Scipio replied, that the hope with which he had come to Africa, and his hope had been further raised by the successful outcome of his campaign, was that he would return home with a victory, not a peace settlement. However, despite almost having victory in his hands, he said he did not reject a peace treaty, so that all peoples might be made aware that the Roman people were fair-minded, both in undertaking and concluding wars. He then declared that the following were in peace terms. The Carthaginians were to hand back prisoners of war, deserters, and runaway slaves. They were to remove their armed forces from Italy and Gaul. They were to stay out of Spain. They were to leave all the islands that lay between Italy and Africa. They were to surrender all but 20 of their warships and hand over 500,000 measures of wheat and 300,000 of barley. As for the financial indemnity in Scipio's demands, there is little agreement on the amount. In one source, I find 5,000 talents, in another 5,000 pounds of silver, in a third a demand for double his men's pay. You will be given 3 days to consider whether you are willing to accept peace on these terms, said Scipio. If you are willing, make a truce with me and send representatives to the Senate in Rome. With that, the Carthaginians were dismissed, as they were now playing for time to allow Hannibal to cross to Africa. They felt that no terms of peace should be refused, and so they went one group of representatives to Scipio to arrange the truce, and another to Rome to ask for a peace treaty. The latter group made a show of taking along a few prisoners, deserters, and runaway slaves, so that the peace treaty would be more easily attainable. 17. Many days before this, Laelius arrived in Rome with Sfax and more important Numidian prisoners of war. He gave the senators an ordered account of operations in Africa, prompting great elation over the current situation and raising great hopes for the future. When the question was put on the matter, the senators voted that the king should be sent to Elba for imprisonment, and that Laelius should be kept back in Rome until the Carthaginian representatives arrived. A decree was passed authorizing 4 days of public prayer. The praetor, Publius Aelius, adjourned the Senate and then convened the popular assembly. There he mounted the rostra with Gaius Laelius. The people were told of Carthaginian armies being routed, of an enormously famous king being defeated and taken prisoner, of all Numidia being overrun in a singularly successful campaign. The people could not contain their euphoria. In silence, they made clear their extravagant jubilation, with cheers and all the usual manifestations of joy of the masses. The praetor accordingly gave an immediate order for the temple custodian to open up the holy places throughout the city, and for the people to be given the opportunity of doing the rounds of them throughout the day, paying homage and giving thanks to the gods. The next day, Aelius brought Massinissa's envoys into the Senate. They first of all congratulated the senators on Publius Scipio's successes in Africa, and then expressed their gratitude to them for the fact that Scipio had not merely addressed Massinissa, boy. The next day, Aelius brought Massinissa's envoys into the Senate. They first of all congratulated the senators on Publius Scipio's successes in Africa, and then expressed their gratitude to them for the fact that Scipio had not merely addressed Massinissa as a king, but had actually made him so by restoring him to his father's kingdom. Now that Sphax had been deposed, Massinissa would remain on the throne without fear and without opposition. If such was the Senate's decision, they said, they also thanked the Senate for Scipio's commendation of Massinissa before an assembly of his army, and for the presentation of splendid gifts that he made to the king. Massinissa had done his best, and would go on doing his best to show himself worthy of this treatment. They added that the king requested that the Senate ratify by decree the royal title and other benefits and gifts conferred on him by Scipio, and he further requested that, if it did not displease them, they send back any Numidian prisoners in custody in Rome. That, they explained, would very much redound to the king's credit amongst his people. The repose given to the envoys was that congratulations for successes in Africa that they offered to the Senate should be shared with the king. Furthermore, they said, Scipio's action in addressing Massinissa as a king was, in the Senate's opinion, correct and proper, and the members fully approved of everything else Scipio had done to gratify Massinissa. They also passed a decree authorizing gifts for the envoys to bear the king: 2 purple cloaks, each with a golden clasp, 2 tunics with a broad stripe, 2 horses with their harness decorations, 2 sets of cavalry armor with cuirasses, and tents and military paraphernalia of the kind usually provided for a consul. The praetor was instructed to see that the gifts were sent to the king. The envoys were each given a minimum of 5,000 asses, and their attendants 1,000 each, and 2 tunics were presented to each ambassador, and one of the attendants and the Numidians who were to be released from custody and restored to the king. In addition, a decree authorized the provision of free of charge accommodation and entertainment for the envoys. Mm-hmm. 18. During the summer that these senatorial decrees were passed in Rome and military operations were being conducted in Africa, the praetor Publius Quintilius Varus and proconsul Marcus Cornelius clashed in pitched battle with the Carthaginian Mago in the land of Insubrian Gauls. The praetor's legions were in the front line. Cornelius kept his in reserve, but he himself rode up to the front and there, positioned before the 2 wings, praetor and pronounced both urged on the men to mount an all-out attack on the enemy. They were achieving no success with this, and then Quintilius said to Cornelius, "As you see, the battle is losing momentum. The enemy's fear is being hardened into stubbornness by a resistance that is succeeding beyond their expectations, and there is a risk of it developing into boldness. We should get a brisk cavalry charge going if we want to shake them and make them give ground. So either you must keep up the pressure at the front while I lead the cavalry into battle, or I shall look after matters here in the front line, while you unleash the cavalry of 4 legions on the enemy." The proconsul was prepared to accept whatever part of the task the praetor wanted him to take. The praetor, Quintilius, then went forward to the cavalry with his son, an intrepid young man. His praenomen was Marcus, and ordered them to mount up. He unleashed them against the enemy. The disarray caused by the cavalry was heightened by the shouts that arose from the legions, and the enemy line not have held had it not been for Mago, who, when the cavalry first made their move, immediately brought the elephants, which were kept ready for action, into the fight. The horses were terrified by their trumpeting, their smell, and their appearance, and this completely undermined the assistance brought by the cavalry. While the Roman cavalry were in the midst of the action, where they could use lance and sword at close quarters, they had the upper hand. But when they were carried away from the fight by the startled horses, they became, at a distance, better targets for the Numidian javelins. At the same time, among the infantry, the 12th Legion had been mostly cut down and was holding its ground more to avoid humiliation than by virtue of its strength. It would not have held on any longer had not the 13th, which was brought into the front line from the reserves, taken up the indecisive struggle. Mago, too, went to his reserves, bringing up some Gauls to face his fresh legion. But these were scattered without much of a fight, and the Hastati of the 11th Legion was bunched on the infantry line as well. The animals were massed together, and so when the Romans hurled their javelins at them, hardly any missed the mark. They then drove them all back to their own battle line, 4 of them collapsing from the severity of their wounds. It was at that point that the enemy line was first driven back, and when they saw the elephants turn to run, all the Roman cavalry came pouring out to increase the panic and disorder. As long as Mago stood before the standards, however, the Carthaginians retreated only by degrees, preserving their ranks and orderly manner of fighting. But when they saw him fall, this Thyron, through by a weapon, and being carried from the field virtually lifeless, they all immediately turned to flight. Approximately 5,000 of the enemy were killed that day, and 22 military standards were taken. But it was no bloodless victory for the Romans either. Casualties in the Praetor's army numbered 2,300, by far the greatest number coming from the 12th Legion. 2 military tribunes, Marcus Cosconius and Marcus Mavius, were also lost from that legion, and from the 13th, which had been involved in the closing moments of the fight. Another military tribune, Gaius Helvius, fell as he was re-establishing the battle. In addition, about 22 eminent knights, along with a number of centurions, were crushed to death by the elephants. The battle might have gone on, but the Carthaginians ceded victory when their leader was wounded.